General Hospital spoilers reveal that Michael had always prided himself on being a man of logic, a man who could keep his emotions in check and make decisions that were grounded in reason. But nothing had prepared him for the storm that was now brewing in his life. The truth about Willow, the woman he had once trusted with everything, had been slowly unraveling in front of him. Piece by piece. It had started with small, almost insignificant details, things that seemed too strange to ignore. But Michael had pushed them aside. Not wanting to confront the reality that his ex-wife might be hiding something far darker than he could have imagined. It was the moment when he realized the truth about Sasha that everything began to fall into place. Sasha Gilmore Corbin had been manipulated, not by just anyone, but by Willow. The same Willow who had shared a life with Michael, the same Willow who had borne his children. It was a revelation that struck him with the force of a freight train, leaving him breathless and reeling. How could she have done something so cruel? How could the woman he had once loved be capable of such manipulation? Of using another person's life to get what she wanted? The more Michael thought about it, the more the pieces fell together. Sasha's sudden disappearance, the strange behavior that had followed. The way she had taken Daisy and vanished without a trace, it all made sense now. But what disturbed him the most wasn't just the manipulation of Sasha. It was the realization that Willow had been willing to put Daisy in harm's way in order to cover up her own actions. Michael couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened to that innocent little girl, how her life had been turned upside down by someone he had once trusted completely. The weight of that knowledge was unbearable, and it gnawed at him, fueling a fire of anger and betrayal that he couldn't extinguish. But the worst part of it all was that Michael had let it go on for so long. He had trusted Willow, had believed that her intentions were pure. He had allowed her to be a part of his life. To be a part of their children's lives, without knowing the depths of her deception. Now, he could see it clearly, her lies, her manipulation. Her complete disregard for the consequences of her actions. And all of it had led to a place where Daisy's safety was at risk, where the innocent had been harmed. All in the name of Willow's own twisted agenda. Michael's world had been shattered. The truth, as painful as it was, had forced him to look at everything he had built, his family, his relationships, his trust in people, in a new light. It was hard to come to terms with the fact that the woman he had once loved, the woman he had trusted with his children, had been hiding such a dark side from him. And now, he had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. His mind raced. Torn between the need to protect his children and the desire to confront Willow and Nina, to make them both understand the gravity of the situation. Michael couldn't just let this slide. He couldn't allow Willow to walk away unscathed, not when Daisy's life had been at risk. And it wasn't just about Daisy anymore. It was about the very fabric of his family. The trust that had been destroyed by one woman's selfishness. He couldn't let Willow go free, she needed to be held accountable for what she had done. It was clear to Michael now that Willow needed help. But the question remained, how could he get her the help she needed without completely destroying what little was left of their family? How could he fix the damage that had already been done without completely losing the battle? He had to make a choice, and it was one that would define the rest of his life. Michael wasn't the type to make rash decisions. He was calculated, thoughtful, and always considered the long-term consequences of his actions. But this was different. This was about his children. This was about the future he had worked so hard to build, the future he wanted to protect. And he couldn't protect it with Willow in the picture, not when he couldn't trust her anymore. In the days that followed, Michael began to formulate a plan. It was a difficult one. A plan that would force him to confront the woman he had once loved and the woman who had once been his mother-in-law. But he knew it was the only way to ensure that his children, his family, could move forward in a way that was safe and secure. He couldn't allow Willow's manipulations to tear apart everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build. The first step was to confront Nina. He had to tell her everything he had discovered, to make her understand just how dangerous Willow had become. Nina might have been estranged from her daughter. But Michael knew she still cared for her. She had to understand that Willow's actions weren't just a cry for help, they were calculated, manipulative, and dangerous. And if she didn't act now? The truth was hard for any mother to hear, and it was clear that Nina wasn't ready to process everything Michael had told her. But he had no time to waste. He couldn't let Nina's shock get in the way of what needed to be done. He told her that Willow needed psychiatric help, that she needed to be sent to Ferncliff before she caused any more harm. Before she hurt anyone else. Nina's face paled as she listened to Michael, her hands shaking slightly. But Michael knew there was no other option. Willow had to be stopped. She had to face the consequences of her actions. And if Nina was the only one who could make that happen, then Michael would do whatever it took to convince her. Nina didn't argue. But the pain was evident in her eyes. She had always tried to protect Willow, to help her daughter in the ways she knew best. But now, she had to let go. She had to be strong, not just for Willow, but for the entire family. Michael's words rang in her ears, and she knew what had to be done. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be painless, but it was the right thing to do. Michael knew that this decision, this ultimatum, would change everything. It would fracture the last remnants of his relationship with Willow, and it would likely push Nina further away. But he couldn't focus on that right now. He had to focus on what was best for his children, on what was best for the future. And so, he made his final decision. He would do everything in his power to ensure that Willow faced the consequences of her actions, no matter the cost. He would make sure that Nina did the right thing. Even if it meant losing her trust. The safety of his children, the future of his family, depended on it. As Michael walked away from Nina's house, his mind was heavy with the weight of what he had just set into motion. He knew that this wasn't the end, that there would be more battles to fight and more decisions to make. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. He was doing the right thing. And that was all that mattered. Now, he just had to hope that everyone else would come to see it that way too. The story that Nina and Liesl had been desperately trying to protect was now teetering on the edge of complete devastation. The lengths they had gone to in order to shield Nina from the bitter truth were finally being undone, and the consequences of their actions were threatening to explode in their faces. What they had hoped to bury forever, hidden in the deepest recesses of their lives, was now on the brink of being exposed. It was one of the biggest shocks they had ever faced. A revelation so powerful that it could unravel everything they had worked to protect. They had spent years building a fragile peace. Carefully creating a narrative to shield Nina from the fallout of her past mistakes, but now, all their efforts were in vain. The truth was coming to light. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. Nina had already endured so much. Her complicated relationships, her troubled past. The betrayals and losses, they had all led her to this point where she thought she had found some measure of stability. But the universe had a way of testing people's resolve, and now, Nina was once again standing at the edge of another emotional precipice. This new revelation wasn't just about Nina's past, it was about everything she had built in her present. It was the kind of bombshell that could destroy relationships, tear families apart, and leave nothing but the wreckage of what used to be. Liesl, too, was caught in the web of their secrets. Doing everything she could to protect Nina from the fallout. But she knew, deep down, that their carefully crafted wall of protection was starting to crumble. They had done everything to keep Nina's history from catching up with her, but now, it seemed inevitable. The moment of truth was upon them, and neither of them could control it anymore. The more Nina tried to hold on to the life she had made, the more it slipped through her fingers. In the midst of this chaos, Michael had emerged as a force neither Nina nor Liesl had anticipated. What they had thought were buried secrets were now being dragged into the light, piece by painful piece. Michael, who had once been a victim of their manipulations, was now the one wielding the power. He had discovered the truth. He had seen through the layers of deception and had finally put the pieces together. The story Nina and Liesl had tried so hard to bury. The lies they had crafted to protect themselves, were about to be exposed in the harshest possible way. Michael wasn't just uncovering secrets, he was rewriting the narrative. The truth was no longer something Nina and Liesl could control. They had underestimated the power of Michael's resolve and the lengths he was willing to go to in order to protect his family. The shock wasn't just in the revelation of what Nina and Liesl had done, but in Michael's response. His quiet, calculated strength was transforming into something far more dangerous. He had the leverage now, and he wasn't afraid to use it. As the weight of the situation began to sink in, Nina and Liesl realized just how much they had underestimated Michael. They had thought that they could keep their secrets hidden, that the past would stay buried. But Michael's persistence, his determination to uncover the truth, had changed everything. The game had shifted, and Michael was now the one in control. As Nina and Liesl scrambled to salvage whatever they could, Michael was taking charge of the story, rewriting it in a way they never could have imagined. The power dynamics were shifting, and with each new piece of the puzzle Michael uncovered, Nina and Liesl found themselves backed into a corner. There was no way out anymore. The walls they had built to protect themselves from the consequences of their past were now closing in around them. The revelation that Michael was about to unleash was more than just a bombshell, it was a complete transformation of the narrative. Nina and Liesl's world, which they had worked so hard to protect, was on the verge of collapse. The truth, once hidden, was now about to come crashing down, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Michael, who had been a pawn in their game for so long, had now become the master of his own destiny. With the pieces of the story in his hands, he was poised to change everything. For Nina and Liesl, the battle was far from over. But the rules had changed, and Michael's next move would set the stage for a new chapter in their lives, one that none of them could have predicted. The truth, in all its raw and painful glory, was finally going to be exposed, and with it, everything they had tried to protect would come crumbling down. There was no way to outrun it now. The story that once belonged to Nina and Liesl was now in Michael's hands, and he was determined to ensure that the truth would be told, no matter the cost. Michael had finally uncovered the shocking truth. Drew was blackmailing Willow. The revelation came as a devastating blow to him. It wasn't just the manipulation of Sasha that had left Michael reeling. It was now clear that Drew was using the truth about Daisy's kidnapping as leverage to try and win back Willow's love. The realization hit Michael with the force of a freight train. Drew, a man he once trusted, was now using such a sensitive, damaging secret to manipulate Willow. All in an effort to reclaim something he had lost. For Michael, this betrayal was not just a personal blow, it was a betrayal of the worst kind. One that not only jeopardized Willow's future but also put his children's safety at risk. Drew's attempt to blackmail Willow into rekindling their relationship was a twisted move. But it was the revelation of the deeper implications, the kidnapping of Daisy, that truly shook Michael to his core. Michael had always known Drew as a man who lived by a moral code, even if that code wasn't always clear. But now, seeing Drew stoop so low as to use Daisy's kidnapping to manipulate Willow, it was as though the man Michael thought he knew had vanished. The realization that Drew would stoop to such tactics to win Willow back opened Michael's eyes to the full extent of the danger Willow was in. This was no longer just about personal vendettas and betrayal, it was about the very fabric of their family being manipulated and torn apart by a secret so dangerous it could destroy everything. The weight of this new information was unbearable for Michael. He knew that Drew's blackmail wouldn't just disappear. It was a threat that could very well unravel everything Michael had worked to protect. His children, his family. The peace he had fought so hard for, all of it could be shattered if Drew's plan succeeded. Michael's anger began to boil, and with it came a new determination. This wasn't just about protecting Willow anymore. It was about protecting everything he held dear. If Drew was going to use blackmail to get what he wanted, Michael would not hesitate to strike back. But as Michael processed the gravity of the situation, something deeper began to form within him. His anger was morphing into something else, something darker. The realization that Drew had crossed a line he couldn't come back from ignited a new kind of obsession within Michael. He was no longer simply trying to protect his family from the fallout of Willow's manipulations. Now, he was determined to use the power he had to bring Drew to his knees. This wasn't just about undoing the damage Drew had caused, it was about making Drew pay for what he had done to Willow and, by extension, to Michael's entire family. Michael had a new story now. One he wasn't going to shy away from. The power he had once been reluctant to wield was now at his fingertips, and he was ready to use it. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about reclaiming control over his life and ensuring that Drew would never have the power to manipulate his family again. As Michael began to plan his next steps, he realized that this new revelation had given him something even more potent than just knowledge. It had given him leverage. Drew had underestimated Michael's ability to fight back. And now that Michael had the upper hand, there was no going back. Drew's attempts to manipulate Willow and use her against Michael had only served to push Michael further into a corner where he was ready to strike. The stakes had never been higher. And Michael was prepared to bring Drew down, no matter what it took. The obsession that had been building within him, the need for revenge, for retribution, was now at the forefront of his mind. He had to make sure that Drew paid for what he had done, and he wouldn't stop until that price was paid. This obsession wasn't just about proving a point. It was about ensuring that Willow would never be in a position to fall victim to Drew's manipulations again. Michael knew that the psychological toll this situation was taking on her was immense. And he couldn't let it go on any longer. His new mission was clear: he would stop Drew, make him face the consequences of his actions, and in doing so, ensure the safety and future of his family. But as Michael began to plan, he couldn't help but realize that this obsession, this need for retribution, might be the very thing that would change him. Would he still be the same man who valued logic and fairness, or would he become someone darker, more vengeful, as he sought to make Drew pay for his sins? It was a question that would haunt him as he moved forward, but one thing was certain: Michael was no longer willing to sit back and let his life be dictated by the manipulations of others. He had his own story now, and this time, he was in control. Michael's obsession had reached its peak. The calm, calculating man who had once prided himself on making logical decisions now found himself in the grip of something darker, something far more dangerous. The shocking truth about Drew's blackmail had ignited a fire within him, one that was fueled not just by anger but by an obsessive desire to regain control over his life, his family, and his future. The deception, the manipulation, the threats to his children's safety, everything that had been done to him and his family had built to this point, where Michael was ready to take drastic action. And his first target? Willow and Nina. They had become the symbols of the chaos in his life. Their betrayal, their lies, their disregard for the consequences of their actions had pushed Michael to the edge. He could no longer sit by and allow them to continue manipulating the situation, affecting not only his family's safety but his own peace of mind. He had a plan, and it was clear in his mind: it was time to remove them from his life, permanently. The first step of Michael's plan was to make sure that Willow was removed from his children's lives. He couldn't trust her anymore. What had started as a relationship based on love and trust had turned into a tangled web of deceit and psychological manipulation. Willow's actions, the manipulation of Sasha, the use of Daisy as leverage, her collusion with Drew, had shown Michael the true face of the woman he had once trusted. She wasn't just someone who had made a mistake. She was someone who had repeatedly put his children in danger for her own benefit. He couldn't allow her to remain in their lives, but to expel her from Port Charles. Michael knew that he needed more than just his own resolve. He needed Nina. He had a plan to make Nina see reason, or perhaps to make Nina feel so trapped by the truth that she would have no choice but to act. Nina, however, wasn't an easy target. She had her own guilt, her own demons. Her relationship with Willow was complicated, strained by both the mother-daughter bond and the dark truths that had come to light. Nina had been living in a delusion, trying to protect Willow at any cost, even when she knew her daughter was tangled in a mess of lies and manipulation. But now, the truth was undeniable. Michael knew that he could use that truth to push Nina into a corner where she had no choice but to act. He wasn't going to give her any options. He would force her to choose. And he would make sure that her choice was one that would benefit his family, not hers. Michael would make Nina see that Willow's presence in their lives was a liability, a dangerous one. and that the only way to protect his children and his future was to get rid of her, and to do it swiftly. The idea of sending Willow to Ferncliff was already taking shape in Michael's mind. He knew that if Nina was pushed hard enough, she would send Willow there herself. Nina, in her desperation to protect her daughter, had become blind to the fact that Willow needed more than protection. She needed accountability. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. And if Nina couldn't see that, then Michael would make sure she did. The thought of Willow locked away in Ferncliff gave Michael a sense of satisfaction, a sense of control over a situation that had spiraled out of his hands for far too long. It was a drastic measure. But Michael was no longer afraid of the consequences. He had already made his peace with the fact that this would destroy any semblance of a relationship with Nina. He had no choice. There was too much at stake. As Michael continued with his plans, his obsession grew. He began to see Willow and Nina as obstacles, as threats to everything he was trying to build. And he wasn't willing to let them destroy his future. The thought of sending Willow away to Ferncliff, where she would be forced to face the consequences of her actions, filled him with a sense of purpose that he had not felt in years. This wasn't just about removing them from his life, it was about asserting his control. Michael realized that this new path he was on was more than just about justice. It was about domination. He had been pushed too far. And now he was taking back everything that had been stolen from him. The decision to expel them from Port Charles wasn't just a personal choice, it was a declaration. It was Michael's way of asserting dominance over a situation that had spiraled out of his control. He couldn't let them stay, couldn't let them continue to have a hold on him or his family. The ramifications of his actions were clear, and Michael understood that the fallout would be catastrophic. The family he had fought to protect would be torn apart. His relationship with Nina would be irreparably damaged. But Michael didn't care about the consequences anymore. His obsession with protecting his children, with securing his future, had consumed him. There was no room for mercy. But as Michael prepared to execute his plan, something within him began to shift. The weight of his decision began to feel heavier than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. It wasn't just about getting rid of Willow and Nina. It was about the toll this obsession was taking on him. The power. The control. It was intoxicating, but it was also changing him. Michael realized that with each step he took down this path, he was leaving behind pieces of himself that he would never get back. The man who had once been driven by logic and fairness was now becoming someone else, someone whose obsession with revenge and control was starting to define him. He wasn't just removing a threat to his family, he was transforming into something darker, something that might never return to the man he once was. As Nina, still struggling with the reality of what was happening, began to consider Michael's ultimatum, she faced a choice she never imagined she would have to make. The threat of losing her daughter. The woman she had protected all her life, was now looming over her. Sending Willow to Ferncliff would be an irreversible decision. One that would sever the last remaining ties between mother and daughter. But Michael's pressure, his obsession with making sure Willow faced the consequences of her actions, was too much to ignore. In the end, Nina knew that Michael was right, Willow needed to be held accountable. She needed help, and there was no other way to make her see that. With a heavy heart and a mind clouded by the weight of the decision, Nina agreed. She would send Willow to Ferncliff, not because she wanted to, but because she knew that it was the only way to protect her from herself and from the consequences of her actions. It was a tragic moment. One that would forever change the dynamic between mother and daughter, but it was also the moment when Nina realized that the damage done by Willow's manipulation couldn't be undone. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally reached its peak, and now, there was nothing left to do but watch as everything they had tried to protect came crashing down around them. The consequences of their choices, the weight of their secrets, were finally catching up with them, and the future of Port Charles, and Michael's future, would never be the same again.